Plywood or MDF? Which one should I use for my projects? What are the pros and cons of each? Those are the questions that I've heard countless times from DIYers. They want to know if I have a preference or if one is just better than the other one. And the answer I always have to tell them is, it depends. Depends on what you're building, what kind of tools you're using, and on about a dozen other things as well. I've used both materials hundreds of times over the years. I've done lots of built-ins with both, and I'll confess that I like one far more than the other one, and we'll get to that. But they're both useful. It's just a matter of matching the right material with the right job. So with that said, let's do a head-to-head comparison of MDF and plywood, and that's coming up now on the Honest Carpenter Show. When we're talking about MDF and plywood in this video, we're talking about sheet panel goods. The wood products and building materials that come in sheets, typically 4 feet by 8 feet. You take these sheets and break them down into smaller sizes to build a huge variety of things. Let's do a real quick anatomy breakdown of the two products because it's going to make everything that comes afterwards easier to understand. We'll start with the big question. What are they made of? Really easy to answer because it's the same thing for both. Wood. Both MDF and plywood are tree-based wood byproducts, and they both contain a lot of something else. Glue. Of the two of them, plywood is closest to normal lumber because it's made of a bunch of very thin layers of wood. These layers, or veneers, are stacked up like a sandwich, and they're adhered to each other using glue, heat, and pressure. Each layer is laid 90 degrees to the one below it and above it, so grain patterns are always running in different directions. This makes the plywood much stronger because it counteracts wood's tendency to split or bow. MDF, on the other hand, doesn't share these properties. This is because MDF is made of fine wood pulp and glue, sort of like a mush, that gets flattened and pressed into sheets. So it has no grain to it, no linear lumber running through it. It's almost more like a cake batter that gets pressed into a shape. It has a lot more in common with fiberboard than plywood. In fact, that's what the F in MDF stands for, medium density fiberboard. It's just a step up from normal fiberboard, that crumbly, cheap material that so many of our cabinets and shelves are made of. Now, at this point, it could be easy for me to say, oh, it's just fiberboard, it's garbage, but that would be pretty unfair. MDF uses smaller fibers, so the finished product is smoother and more uniform. And MDF actually has some applications where it really shines. You just have to work around its limitations. So let's get back to our comparison. We'll start with the point most people are interested in, cost. There's a popular idea out there that MDF is a cheaper alternative to plywood. And for the most part, this is accurate. MDF is a relatively cheap product. A full sheet runs you about $35 with tax. And half-inch thick sheets tend to be a little bit less than that. And you also have quarter-inch MDF, which most people just call backing board. That's even cheaper, maybe $20 with tax. So how much does the alternative, plywood, cost? It depends, because when you say plywood, you're actually talking about dozens or hundreds of different products, because there are so many grades of plywood. Various grades have different uses. There are interior and exterior plywoods. There are plywoods that have one decent finished surface and an ugly surface on the other side. And there are plywoods in every degree of thickness from 3/4 down to 1/8 of an inch. The thing is, a lot of these plywoods aren't any more expensive than MDF. It's just a question of what grade you're getting. For BC grade plywood, which only has one somewhat decent surface, you might pay about what you would pay for MDF. But then for anything of a higher quality in that same 3/4 thickness, you can start to see that price go up to $50, even $65 a sheet. At that point, it becomes a bigger question of what you're trying to do with that material, which brings us to our second topic. What are MDF and plywood used for? The truth is, it's kind of an endless range of things, but where MDF and plywood sheets mostly wind up is in shelving, built-ins, and cabinets. Because they come in larger sheets, you're free to break them down to whatever size you need. You don't have to edge join individual boards like you would if you were using dimensional lumber. This makes MDF and plywood perfect for custom building all sorts of shelving. But the two of them are not interchangeable. I've done a lot of built-ins over time, and there are situations I'm definitely going to use plywood and situations where I'm going to use MDF. I base these decisions on several different factors. The first one being strength. Plywood is stronger than MDF because it has that actual wood grain makeup. If I'm building with MDF, which is what I made this very simple entertainment center from, I make sure to place vertical supports no more than 28 inches apart. If shelves are spanned over that, I'm afraid they'll begin to sag from anything placed on top of them. Plywood, on the other hand, I might be tempted to span a little bit further because it isn't as prone to sagging, and plywood is more durable. Furniture and shelves built with plywood are tougher than MDF projects. At least, that's what I've found. Corners and edges don't get bent or dinged as easily, and they hold together better when they're moved around. I mean, just look what happens to fiberboard furniture when you have to move it a few times. Think IKEA furniture. Components just pull right apart. MDF can fail similarly, and it tends to be heavier than plywood, so things you build are harder to manage. If you haven't put a lot of redundant strength into your project, you can pull components apart just by handling them. And as far as appearances go, there are also drastic differences between MDF and plywood. One question I always ask, is it going to get painted or stained? Both products will generally hold paint very well, so long as they're primed. But MDF is not a stain grade product. Again, because of that fibrous nature of how it's made and pressed, it doesn't have a wood grain surface. There's nothing for stain to penetrate and really nothing for it to show. Plywood, on the other hand, does have a stainable surface because the top layer or veneer is actual wood. There's a grain there for stain to penetrate into. And in some cases, you can skip stain altogether on plywood and just go with a clear seal, like a urethane finish. This is a really popular looking modern architecture, and it's possible because high grades of plywood, like birch and maple and oak, have such a high quality veneer, they look great when the finish is natural. That's really what you buy them for. There's no point getting a high grade plywood if you're just gonna hide it with paint. You want to accentuate that grain, make it stand out. Just remember that when you do get into that class of plywood, individual sheets are going to start to cost double what MDF costs. Those are cabinet grade plywoods, and they're really best for projects where aesthetic quality is of the highest value. Another thing to consider about these is workability. How do MDF and plywood respond to tools, to being cut and fastened? Here's another place where differences really show up. They'll both feel similar when cutting. But MDF cuts a little more smoothly and much more cleanly. Again, with no real grain to tear up, the saw doesn't cause splintering in MDF. A ragged blade will make a harsh cut, but a sharp blade will make a razor tight cut, and that includes rips and cross cuts. Plywood, on the other hand, is very susceptible to tear out. You have to use all the woodworker tricks to protect your edge or it'll splinter and blow out. I talked about this in my kerf video a few weeks back, so check that one out when you get a chance. Both plywood and MDF can be drilled with normal drill bits. That works out fine. But when it comes to fasteners, MDF does not want to hold a screw nearly as well as plywood. Plywood has that wood grain, which is good material for screw threads to grab. MDF, on the other hand, just has the fiber core. So a screw will often tear that material to powder or get stuck in the glue, bind up, and even snap off. And things are worse on MDF edges. With pre-drilling, you can safely set a screw into a plywood edge. It won't cause splitting unless you fail to pre-drill. But with MDF, you're going straight into the fiber core, the softest part of the material, and the edge will either split into fragment layers or the screws will just pull out with little effort. Not effective at all. And while we're speaking about the edge of the material, it really brings us to a similarity between the products. Edge exposure. Neither plywood nor MDF has a nice looking edge. When you see the edges of both, what you're seeing is what they're made of, what's inside of them. Plywood edges will show the sandwich layering, and MDF edges will have a grainy, textured look. For any type of nicer built-ins or cabinets, you pretty much always want to hide this edge, usually with a screen trim or laminate of some sort. But MDF has the slight advantage here in that it routes more cleanly than plywood does. A router will just show the ugly core of plywood, and even worse, it'll actually expose more gaps down in the wood. But routed MDF edges take on a more subtle texture that can be sanded to a higher finish. Really good router bits can be used to make high-quality figured panels out of MDF. You see it get used a lot on nice paneling projects in hallways and stairs. And working both materials with power tools brings up another important topic: dust control. On the whole, plywood makes about as much sawdust as normal lumber does. You should try to use vacuum filtration when you can and wear a dust mask. The rest you can sweep up. But MDF makes a dust that is far worse. It's like pure powder. It spews into the air, sticks to everything, and if you breathe it even for a little while, you'll be coughing all day. Always wear a mask when working with MDF, and if possible, try to get some open air ventilation. You might just want to move your setup outside just to deal with MDF dust. And then when you're done, move everything back inside, because MDF really has no business being outside for long periods of time. On the topic of indoor-outdoor quality, plywood and MDF really differ. This is because they actually make exterior grade plywoods, which are basically just like other treated lumber. They don't look as good, and they tend to be sort of wavy and warped, but they do resist fungal growth. As for normal, untreated plywood, it will hold up outside, especially if it's painted and the edge grain is caulked. But in the end, it'll start to delaminate and the layers will come apart. I really can't recommend using it outside if there are other options. For MDF though, it should never be used outside. It's basically designed to fail. When it's exposed to water, those wood fibers act like a sponge, drinking up moisture. Yes, you can paint it and that will help, but the moment that paint ruptures or flakes just a bit, the soaking process starts, that MDF bloats and turns to mush. Keep MDF indoors. Use it on your interior shelving and built-ins where it's totally stable. That's my recommendation. Somewhere in the 90s, material companies started making exterior trim out of this stuff. They said it was formulated or designed for moisture control, things like that. But it's still just MDF. I don't care how well you design it, it's going to fail faster than wood. I'll do a whole video on that at some point because it's a real pet peeve of mine, but we can just leave it at that for now. And I'll wrap up by saying that of the two of them, I really prefer plywood. I like it for its strength and durability. I like that it doesn't weigh a ton, especially half-inch thick plywood, which I use for a lot of projects. I like the fact that it doesn't turn into toxic powder when you cut it. Over the last several years, I've used way more plywood than MDF for projects. And even though it's a bit more expensive, you're actually seeing more cheap alternatives to cabinet-grade plywood coming out these days. Things like Stainability and radiata pine plywood have a very decent appearance and texture, but they're priced closer to MDF, so you can buy them without feeling a big price pinch. The one other good thing I'll mention about MDF though, is that it's very flat. Even decent plywoods can take on a bow if stored incorrectly, or if moisture gets to them. And you have to fight that warp out of your panels when you're working with it. MDF doesn't tend to do this as much. You can pretty much always trust you're going to get a really flat, stable material with MDF. Just something else to think about there. That's my 2 cents on the topic though. What are your opinions on it? Do you use MDF a lot? Have any tricks that make it work better? Or are you strictly birch plywood kind of person? Let me know down in the comments. I'm always eager to hear other opinions. As always, thanks for watching. Be sure to check back in for more videos coming up soon. And please consider subscribing and hitting that little bell button beside the subscribe button to turn on notifications. That way you'll know the moment we post something. I'm Ethan James with HonestCarpenter.com. I'll see you next time.